Matthew Phelps, co-author of the Turning to God's Word Bible study, You Shall Have No Other Gods, the book of Exodus. Today we'll be talking about lesson 18 of our study, which covers the book of Exodus, chapter 21, verse 1 through chapter 23, verse 19. In the previous lesson, we talked at length about the Ten Commandments. And in this lesson now, we will be moving on to a much more practical version of the law. That's maybe not quite the right way to put it. As we talked about with the Ten Commandments, those are things that are like the absolute, those are the deal breakers in terms of relationship with God, right? Those are all and entirely about you can't do these things and have a relationship with God, or go against these things. That's kind of the baseline, right? And it's more or less, I know some of it is like, thou shalt not kill, but it's still more or less entirely about who God is and how one has relationship with God. And how we would think about that in the church today, those would be the things that we'd look at as like big T traditions, right? These are the definitive, absolute teachings of the church that are revelation about God and our relationship with Him, that are inviolable, unmovable. They are, and always will be. Then we have these other things that are small T traditions in our church, right? There's the stuff that'll never change, and then there's the stuff like Mass used to be said in Latin and facing east. And now it's done in the vernacular and facing any direction. And the priest used to face also east and now faces the people, right? Those are things, when that small T tradition was in place, that Mass was always in Latin, it was always in Latin, right? Just because that rule can change and we can do a different thing now, which we do, doesn't mean it was okay to not follow that rule back then when it was in place, right? So it's still an important and a binding thing, but it isn't the same level of binding and the same level of rule or law. Another way that I have thought about this that you all may or may not find helpful, but it's a thing I've thought about for a long time, so I'll share it in case it's helpful to anybody. There's this, a lot of talk has been, made about, there's the idea of moral relativism and people treating truth like it's subjective versus, I as the subject define truth for myself versus the idea that truth is an objective, other absolute thing that exists outside of me, which maybe some of these things about God are. But practically speaking, I think a point can be made that, at least so far as we're concerned, truth is relational. It's not subjective, all me, or objective, all something outside of me, but it's in the encounter between me and God that truth manifests. And that's where these sorts of rules come into play, right? God is who He is, and I in my life are what they are. And as those meet, then my life needs to be certain ways to line up with God. But as, human history evolves, times and seasons change, those sorts of things, because we change so much, change. God hasn't changed, but we have. And as we do, because a lot of that stuff is at the meeting point of us and God, those things also change. God has not changed. We have. And as we do, so also do some of these things. These small t traditions, right, that are very important at the time and as they exist, but that are not immutable, unchangeable, and that do evolve and change as humanity changes. That's what these are here in this chapter from the book of Exodus. So a lot of this is chapters. So a lot of this is essentially historical and not to be treated as binding explicitly on us today. The food for thought for us as we read and look at this is to instead think about, well, in our society today and in our world today, what are those things, like what are those manifestations of the commandments of who God is and our relationship with him that indicate how we ought to be living in the world that exists today, and how are we doing upholding those things, right? It doesn't matter. I know it's not in this lesson, but it's in Leviticus, but like the prohibition against eating shellfish is one that gets cited a lot, right? Because it's, or even pork, but because it's in our world, like, and as Christians, we don't need to do that, right? But there was legitimate enough reason at the time that it was a good idea and it was a good thing to do. Okay, so we got rid of that. What did we add in place of the things we got rid of, right? Like, we still need to be living Christian lives in our world today, and that still constrains how we exist in the world and the society that we exist in, and creates rules, small t rules, traditions that ought to be followed to be good Christians in the world we live in. This lesson hopefully will cause us to, and I'm not going to go into great detail about it because, you know, how to live as a Christian in today's world is an exhaustive topic, and we're trying not to have a 10-hour video, but might throw in some examples here and there. But the important takeaway is when we read about, at some length, how to treat our slaves, that is not this saying it's okay to have slaves, right? In a world where it was okay to have slaves, this puts limits on how people treat those slaves. Maybe some of that could be applied to if you are a manager or a business owner. There are ways that are okay and ways that are not okay to treat the people who work for you, right? And they're not the same as you let your slave go free after 6 years. On the 7th year, you let your slave go free, right? It's not the same as that, but that idea is respecting the autonomy and dignity of a human person. And we can do that in how we manage people that we have power over, right? So some of the principles are the same, but the manifestation of them are obviously different. So we will talk some about the historical context of these things, but we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on any, or depth on any of these small t rules, because they don't have specific and particular bearing until the end of this section on how we live our lives today. So it's in the book, we'll talk about it, but if you wondered, that looks like a whole lot of text for one lesson as you're turning the page. It is, and the reason we're putting it all together is because it's more historical in nature and less how I live my life today in nature. So that's what we're going to get to, and a little bit of why that is the takeaway and the thing to think about, and probably more productive to talk about in your groups, is what are those small t traditions that have bearing in our lives today, and how are we doing with those. So slavery existed. Does that mean it was okay? Again, we talked about it in the introduction. In the grander scheme of things, no, it doesn't mean it was okay. But at the time, it was, and this is a way to do it that's more okay. What are these rules doing? They are focused largely on the idea that a slave is not only property, but a person who has their own dignity, right? Like a Hebrew slave specifically has dignity as somebody who is one of the people of God, even if life situations went badly and the person finds him or herself a slave. There are limits to how that person can be treated, such that the person is not purely property, right? These rules largely focus on the person is as person, with dignity as person, as well as slave with use as slave. So how does that have bearing today? We're not slaves. We are in, a lot of people are in, let's say, non-voluntary servitude, right? It is still true that we all have to work to live. It is still true that the economic system that we live in encourages exploiting people who don't have very much and taking advantage and treating them as maybe not slaves but as replaceable cogs in a machine to be squeezed for all that they're worth. If you look at economic development in this country in the last 50 years, the pace of the cost of living has greatly, especially things like housing and education, have greatly outpaced the growth in wages, so that the middle class has been squeezed down and down as more and more wealth has been concentrated with relatively few people, creating a whole lot of people who have no choice but to work in ways that are still oppressive. So do we have slaves? No. Are we creating an exploitative and an oppressive system that dehumanizes and takes advantage of people? Yes. Should we be? No. So do we have a lot of room to talk when we say those people owned slaves? How dumb of them, didn't they know better? And then we're doing something that future generations will condemn as equally evil or very close to the same. Especially, this is not like the slavery like we did in this country, right? It's not good. It's not maybe what we think about. It's not as bad as what we did here. Still not recommended, not slavery bad, but any version of exercising power over and exploiting other people, bad. And recognizing the inherent dignity of people as people, good. Doing anything that's not that, bad. There's the rule. And yes, people had slaves. And good, we don't do that anymore. Don't kill people. We're still saying that, and we still have to say that. We got past the slavery thing, kinda, as we talked about, but the human tendency to enslave, we see still there, still needs guardrails, namely don't do that. Killing people, still don't do that. And if you do, this is where, again, the time side of it matters, right? Some of these things we'll talk about, not only don't do this, but now what is the restitution if you do this? Which the Ten Commandments don't contain, because what happens if you violate the Ten Commandments, right? It severs your relationship with God. You cannot have a relationship with God, and when you do not have a relationship with God, you're dead. So those are all purely and under all circumstances fatal. No, mortal sin is the word that we still use, right? It is sin that cuts us off from relationship with God. That has to be grave matter. I should have said this in the last video, but it was long enough. That has to be grave matter, right? It has to be serious violation, like breaking one of those commandments. You also have to do it with full knowledge that it's that, and with full consent of the will. You can't be otherwise bound or compelled, and you have to know it's a bad thing when you do it. But anyway, when those other circumstances are present, violation of the Ten Commandments, always just death. So we don't have to spend a lot of time on, restitution, because you pay in your life for the sin that you did. These are things where, okay, there are some limits. If you kill somebody, sure, there are times where you're dead. But maybe not always, right? Circumstances. This is where trying to treat all of these laws and rules as objective truth gets really hard, and where people can make a case for subjective truth or relativism, right? It's a bad case, but you can see where they're coming from. Is you have an absolute law of thou shalt not kill, and an idea that if you do, you're going to get killed. Then there are cases where it's premeditated, and like you're laying in wait and you're ready to kill somebody. Okay, great. You really deliberately meant to do that. You planned it, you did it. Okay, maybe eye for an eye works in that context. But what about areas in between? The one here is if somebody didn't lie in wait, but something a little more vague happens, where it's less premeditated, less intentional. Maybe you get in a fight with somebody and you end up killing them, and that wasn't your intention. Does that likewise mean that you should die? What about, we don't do this in our society today usually. Thankfully, we have ways we can safely remove people from society. So we found a way you don't even have to kill people. But should the punishment for, we still have degrees of murder for exactly that reason, right? And abortion is yet another thing. Even though a life is lost and people are involved in the taking of that life, we have a spectrum. Whether you could argue the spectrum is not right, but we treat things differently. And how do you apply objective truth to every situation? Can that be done if you infallibly know God and are able to write every possible situation that somebody could come upon, and you wanted to write the vast and countless volumes that would contain that? Yes, there is an objective version of that could be written down, but it can't be practically understood and lived. The place which is where that again becomes relational, right? If you know God and have that relationship with God, then the truth can become clear in any of these situations, life situations, based on that relationship and that encounter with God, and not based on having to know the absolute objective best thing to do in any given situation, which can be very hard to know in some. So I'm also not saying there is no objective truth, but practically speaking, it's way easier to understand that it's vast and not as simple as thou shalt not kill. And a lot of things are like that, and that doesn't mean it's whatever you want it to be, because it's definitely not that, right? We're still not defining it for ourselves. It's still defined by God, but it can be shaped for ourselves by our encounter with God. So this is an example of there are different restitutions required for the same act, killing somebody. Or there are things that seem less bad than killing somebody to us today, striking your father or mother, that have the same degree of restitution as having intentionally killed somebody. So that the way all of those things line up and align, again, that one we wouldn't, although I can't fathom doing that, I suppose there are people who strike father or mother, and that's no good. But I can think of situations in our world today where maybe they had it coming too, and gray area, right? And that's the whole point. It's not that the truth is gray; it's that the complexities of life as it's lived are myriad, and so we see here an attempt to practically say, okay, here are some situations that could come up, and here's the thing to do about it. And so if we're ranking things, striking your father or mother, really bad, and on purpose killing somebody, really bad, accidentally killing somebody, bad, not as bad. You're going to have to flee and be cut off from your people, but maybe you don't have to die. The point we're getting at is that fluidity kind of the severity of those things, and some of those ideas are shaped culturally, right? And as humanity evolves and changes, and we individually do, the relative weight of some of these things changes. The overall idea of don't do violence to people in any capacity, killing, striking, stealing, don't do violence to people. And if you do, violence will come back around to you. That's universally the case. So don't do that. Really, this is more of the same, right? So if we get beyond the idea-ish of things being fatal, then we start to get to what other restitutions are there, right? The harm that you caused somebody else owes a restitution in kind to balance out the harm, right? If you, this is the famous quote from here, right? An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a hand for a hand, foot for a foot, burn for a burn, wound for a wound, strike for a strike. Usually the quote doesn't make it that far. But the core concept being, right, what you, through your negligence or malfeasance, take from someone else, the harm that you inflict, the restitution is for the same harm to befall you. Importantly, that should be treated as a limit and not an encouragement to exceed what you would otherwise do, right? This is the maximum, right? It's putting bounds on, you can't, because someone harmed you, you can't go above and beyond and harm them more than they harmed you, right? That is not justice. That's not evening the scales, so to speak. That is then doing more harm to the original harmer in the name of justice. And then there's outstanding extra harm that has to be redressed, and that's the kind of thing that leads to a cycle of violence to one another. Because these executions of these, the carrying out of these laws, a lot of these things, is itself violent, right? Which is the thing we think maybe, oh, why would that be true? But it's still true today, right? Like, if the law has to get involved to punish you in some capacity, it is very much a violation that can very well be a violent one. You can get locked up. Even if you get a fine, that's like taking your stuff, right? It's still a violent act on the part of the law to try to exert some kind of justice. It's very important to have boundaries for that. That this is about setting boundaries and not about getting people. It's about limiting how much you are going to get people. It's acknowledging the fact that when you harm someone, a debt is owed. And I think that is an important concept. For whatever reason, in our society, a lot of people got this crazy idea that you can do whatever you want to somebody as long as you say you're sorry, right? Like, oh, I did that, but I'm sorry, so you can't do anything to me now because I said I'm sorry, so we're all good, right? Like, I'm sorry. Like, no, that doesn't, like, it's important to be sorry. That's a good, and to really mean it, right, is a good character development thing on your part. But that doesn't, if you steal from somebody and you're sorry for it, that doesn't give them their possessions back. If you kill somebody and you're sorry about it, that doesn't unkill the person. If you cheat on your wife and you're sorry about it, that doesn't unsleep with someone else. It's the harm is still there, right? And this is a central and a key concept, not just to how we relate to other people, but to how we relate to God. When harm is done to another, restitution is owed to right the relationship, right? Like, to have any chance of righting the relationship, restitution is owed. If I steal your money and I keep your money and tell you I'm sorry, how's that relationship going to go? It's done, right? Unless always situations are complicated, but ideally that means the relationship is done, right? If I rather give you back what I stole, then still very important also to be sorry, right? If I get caught and I say, oh yeah, whoops, my bad, and I give you back your money, again, relationship's going to be in a bad spot because there's no trust there anymore, right? Because I just gave it back to you because I was caught, and why would you think that I'm not going to do that again? So you need to make restitution. You also need repentance. And those things have to go together. How often do we think we can just say we're sorry to God and that fixes it? Right? Like, yeah, I know, if I wrong my wife, I have to do something to make it better beyond just saying I'm sorry. But that's why God's so much better than my wife, because I just have to say sorry to him and like, we're all good, right? No. It's still a relationship, right? The restitution that you pay is as important for you as it is for the other person, right? If you have to suffer the consequences of what you did to somebody else upon yourself, then you are learning in the process, right? The violence you're doing, the wrong you're doing is inflicted back upon you as well, and you feel the wrong that you have committed in a more personal way. And the other person is, to the extent possible, restitution occurs. It's still obviously in all of those cases better if the harm hadn't been done. But once it's been done, if it is to be fixed, and it can't be fixed, of course, but if it's to be mended even, then there needs to be restitution and there needs to be repentance. And for whatever reason, Christianity has gone kind of, at least today, has gone kind of in on the idea of the repentance and kind of skipped or downplayed the idea of restitution. Yes, when we confess, we have repentance is an essential part of that, as is you get a penance that you're supposed to do. That is intended to be that kind of restitution. For being honest, those are usually pretty light, depending on your confessor, but most of the time, yeah. Say the last one I got was say your favorite prayer. Like, Okay, great. My favorite prayer is glory be. Great. We're 5 seconds, we're done. Has that really made restitution? From the eyes of the church? Yes, right? The confessor has the authority, and that is laying that on as the penance. Yes, but, right? Like, and that's where we should be doing more than that saying sorry, right? So that penance is the letter of what's required, right? And some priests are human, right? Some are better at giving penances than others. The example I just gave of one too light, there can also be some that are too hard, right? You can be asked to do something like, I don't know, priest is in a weird mood and asks you to go like confront a person who is abusing you or something, and you're totally not okay doing that. Making up a scenario, but that is the sort of thing that might feasibly, but hopefully never would happen. In which case, if you can't do the penance that is given, you should speak up and say, I really don't think I can do that, Father. Is there something else I can do? Right? And you'll usually be able to accommodate. He will be able to accommodate. Strictly speaking, that penance is the restitution for your sin. But that's, again, between you and God. If you stole from somebody and you confessed it and you say your 2.5 Hail Marys, okay, but the person's still stolen from, right? Like, you still have restitution left to make, right? You don't get to just keep the money and go to confession. Like, that's another form of, well, I said I'm sorry, so it's all good, right? What are you doing to show your repentance for what you did? What are you doing to make restitution to the people you harmed in your life outside of the confessional? What are you doing to God to make restitution for the things that you did wrong outside of the confessional, right? The point of all of this is you owe more than saying you're sorry. You owe more than repentance as a result of sin is harm, right? You are bringing harm and violence into the world. What are you doing to fix or to mend it? What are you doing to bring good into the world, to counterbalance the harm that you've done? What are you doing to right the people that you have wronged by the harm that you have done? What are you doing to build the relationship with God that you have broken down? Okay, you've confessed, great. You are now and you've done your penance. You are now in a place where you can begin to pursue relationship with God again. But the same way as if your spouse catches you being unfaithful and you apologize and you come clean, you admit it, you apologize, you do some counseling, you talk about it. Is the relationship in the same place that it was in before that happened? No. That's where you're at post-confession, right? You have violated the relationship. You have then done a thing that begins to repair the relationship. What are you doing beyond the confession to rebuild and to strengthen the relationship with God, right? There's continued restitution required to repair the relationship beyond just the confession and the penance, right? That's the starting point. You have to do that. Please do that. It's huge and unbelievably generous of God that we can do that, and we should do that a lot. But we need to do things beyond that as well, right? Both toward God and toward other people. The whole point of this chapter is really, how do you make right a wrong that you have done, considering that it cannot be made right? So we limit how much harm can be done back to you. That's the start. But we also recognize that you owe restitution back for the harm that you committed. There's nothing even about saying you're sorry, right? This law doesn't care if you're sorry or not. It cares if you make restitution. You can be not sorry, but for having poked somebody's eye out, but you're still getting your eye poked out. Okay, even enough. There's a world in which if you're leaving one out, the sorry is the one to leave out. You're going to be sorry either way, right? When things come back around. And the more important point is what you're doing about it. And so we've kind of shifted, this is kind of all in on the restitution, and we've moved to, when we care so much about people's feelings, we've moved into like the world of apologies being more important, and so many of them being fake, right? From my point of view, if you really, the best apology is showing someone that you're not going to repeat what you did, right? Words are empty. Show me, right? Like, okay, you acknowledge, you say that was a bad thing that you did and you're sorry about it. Okay, great. I guess prove it, right? Like prove it. And then we could talk. But until I see evidence that you have made and are making effort to change, like I don't believe you. I'm sorry, but like the trust is broken, right? The bad thing happened. That damages trust. Why am I going to believe that you're not going to keep doing the bad thing until you show me evidence of change? And that's where we can get something more positive from this than we can do the violence to ourselves rather than having external systems have to impose it upon us, right? We can say, oh no, I'm not okay being that person that I just was. I have to change myself because I am the kind of person who would do the thing that I just did. The proof's in the pudding, right? By their fruit you will know them, whatever, if you want to use the Jesus version of the saying. I have demonstrated that the person I am is the kind of person that does the thing that I'm not okay with. I have to do violence to myself to change that, right? And to become a kind of person who will not do those things. If it doesn't come from outside, it can come from inside. And I can take it upon myself to change. Anyway, rules are interesting and important. So animals are also property. And as property, you have responsibility for what that animal does. And if you violate somebody else's property in the form of their animals, you owe them back for what you took. The interesting part being, especially being you're responsible for what your animal does to other people, right? If you own and have control over the thing and it does the bad thing, you're responsible for that. You can't just be like super careless about that. Example I can think of, somebody who works for me has a not complete fence between her house and her neighbors apparently, and there was a place where there was a big gap under it, and a dog that had not been appropriately vaccinated and everything else got onto her land and ended up biting or scratching her, and she was briefly worried about rabies, which would be very, very not fun to get and very expensive and possibly fatal if not appropriately treated. So she was really scared for a little while. You can't blame that dog for doing that, right? Like, okay, it's kind of a mean dog, but the animals are going to go where they want to go. They get excited and enthusiastic. The dog didn't decide, I really don't think I want that rabies shot or my vaccines or all of that. I think I'm just going to skip that this year. That's not the dog's decision, right? It's the owner's decision. That dog is the responsibility of the person who chooses to have the dog and puts that dog in their yard, right? And then what the dog does from there is the responsibility of that person. If you can't control what your dog does, you shouldn't have a dog. The dog also, if that dog were to maul a child, it's happened. There are situations where the dog might also be put down for that, right? But the need to put the dog down still is going to be on the owner, right? Like, still the owner's responsibility. We're just not putting the owner down. So even if your property is a thing like an animal that has a mind of its own and might go off and do things on its own, you are still responsible for what that thing does, because it's yours. With animals, that's, I think, fairly clear. We're not quite there, but we're getting awfully close in our world today to something that raises really interesting questions about that concept, which is the idea of AI, right? As we're programming more and more advanced artificial intelligences that can make more and more algorithm-driven decisions, that is an interesting and a potentially very frightening thing. And the people creating those things are responsible for what they do, right? At no point is it going to be true that the computer is solely responsible for what the computer does, right? Like, if you're creating that thing, you're responsible for what it does, right? It might end up being smarter than the dog, might end up being smarter than you, but you are still responsible for what it does. Anyway, a little out in left field. Left is that way, but it is a thing that's coming that raises and will continue to raise interesting moral questions. For now, losses to people's property you need to make up, even if they're done by your property and not by you directly. This one is interesting and I think makes a lot of sense if you think about it. If you steal something from somebody and you're caught, you have to give them back more than what you stole. Why would that happen? Because after all, restitution, they get back the stuff that was stolen, and it's all good, right? Like, they're right where they were. Minus maybe a little bit of time and worrying. The reason for that is there should be disincentive to the thief, right? If all you have to do when you're caught stealing is give back the thing you stole, then even if you're caught 9 times out of 10, then the 10th time you get away with it, your net amount of stuff that you have is still positive from the effort of thievery. So that still makes thieving seem like a thing that you could very viably do. Whereas, if for the thieving you have to give back 2 or 4 times what you stole, then you're going to have to be you're going to have to, more than half the time, maybe more than 75% of the time, get away with the thieving in order for it to be financially viable. And of course, if you get caught at all, then people are going to pay more attention and it'll be harder to get away with it anyway. Your successful rate of thievery has to be very high to make thieving work that way. Versus if you're just breaking even, if you're just giving it back and breaking even, then there's really no disincentive to thieving. And it's really, the idea is practical, right? It's not one of wanting to further punish the thief. It's one of, you have to disincentivize it or people are going to do it. It's like these fines we have for these giant corporations, environmental fines that amount to a rounding error on the ledger. So it's, you really shouldn't dump all of that toxic waste in that river, or you might have to pay, in a year, you might have to pay 1% of a day's profit that you're making doing that. Really, you better not do that. And the corporation looks at the books and says, yeah, we'll just pay the fine, cost of doing business, no problem. The fine was there to disincentivize doing the thing, and it was not a sufficient fine to make that a disincentive. Or even something like a parking ticket, right? You see these pictures of like a Lamborghini parked like in a crazy place that nobody would possibly think that they should park. And it's like, oh, you're going to get a parking ticket, right? The person who can afford a $500,000 car probably doesn't mind if they get a $100 parking ticket. It might be worth it to park there. The disincentive no longer works, right? Well, what the law ought to do is keep the disincentives sufficient that they disincentivize everyone. And when they don't, then they're functionally not laws, right? They're suggestions. Oh, I can just pay this trivial thing to do this thing that you don't want me to do. I'm not disincentivized at all. It's just the cost of doing business. That's why you can't just have the thief pay it back, even, because then you have a disincentive that does not disincentivize. They understood that back then. We don't always do so great with that now. The rules are different governing property between thieving or accidental loss or destruction, right? You need that disincentive there around specifically stealing someone else's property. If you're just negligent with someone else's property or circumstances beyond your control happen, then that even restitution is fine, right? There's no incentive there for you to continue to be negligent because you're still losing, right? If I borrow your ox and it dies, then I have to give you an ox back. It's not like your original ox is there still, right? So it's still like giving you back double. Because in the thieving example, I have your ox and my ox. Here's 2 times your ox back. I am net minus 1 ox. In this scenario, your ox died. I give you an ox back. You're still even in total number of oxen, and I am still net minus 1 ox, right? So the net, my penalty is still there to discourage the negligence, but it doesn't get up to like 4 times like the thieving does, right? It's not as big of a disincentive because it's my negligence, but I don't have to be like punished to the point that it creates a really heavy disincentive, right? I am making right your wrong at my expense, and that's good, right? Can't be careless with other people's property, things that they own. If I cause to lose value, I should make it right. And it should be of or at the same value, right? Something I think of on this that at the time I did not find funny, but looking back on, I can laugh at a little bit. I let someone who had a very serious, he'd had his leg removed as a complication of diabetes, and I let him stay with me for a little while. When he left, which was not under the greatest of circumstances, he'd been staying in my room in my pretty brand new house, and there was significant staining on my essentially brand new carpet, and his offer was he could give me some linoleum he had sitting around that I could put down in my bedroom. That it was unbalanced, right? First of all, it was something he's not using. It didn't cost him anything, right? That's why he offered it. There was no cost to him there. But does it make right or whole? Who wants linoleum in their bedroom, right? Like, it doesn't make whole or right what I lost by that harm that he did, right? Which is why it's laughable, right? Like, he was not trying to make restitution, right? He was trying to pretend like he was making restitution without it costing him anything. That's not restitution, right? Like, it will cost you something because value has been lost for the other person. You have to lose something to make the other person whole, and you have to make the other person whole, not like half, right? Like making the other person half doesn't repair the harm that you did. And it's like, again, looking back on it now, it's kind of, that part of the whole thing is kind of laughable. But at the time, it was still kind of funny, honestly. It was just so preposterous. But now it really is. But it's offensive, right? Like ultimately, it's, oh, I did harm to you, and I'm gonna, like, here's a pittance back, is offensive. Don't do that. If anything, do more rather than less, right? It would be better to offer enough more that the person says, no, that's too much. You only have to do, like, if you're going to make the mistake on trying to overcompensate with the restitution you're making rather than to undercompensate, and you'll have a lot more friends. I should also note that, we got the carpet clean, right? Like shortly after, it wasn't like the stains hadn't set in yet enough. Like we got right to it and it was fine. So like I didn't have to buy new carpet or talk him into making better restitution. It was all good, right? But it sure looked like it might not come clean, but it was all good. The friendship, however, was not. So, sex stuff. Except it's really not, right? These are mostly, if you've noted, rules about property. They're life and property. This isn't, and note the penalty here is just toward the guy, and it's not because only the guy is wrong for seducing the woman to have sex with him, and oh, this poor woman couldn't have had any agency or say in this at all. Like that somehow comes to be how some of this stuff is cast. This is about specifically for the parents and the household, the fact that that daughter has, in a virginal and an unmarried state, this still shouldn't be a thing, by the way, but has monetary value. As long as she is a virgin and is marriageable, she has monetary value. This is not, oh, it was so dirty and achy that they had sex and we have to punish them. There is loss of value because she had sex. And the person who colluded with her in the loss of that value is the one who took that value, right? This is not a sex thing at all. This is a property thing, right? You have effectively taken the property from the family, that value, that monetary value, so you owe it. Whether, like, note if the guy decides, yeah, I really love her and I do want to marry her, then you're all good, right? You can just get married and nobody cares about the sex then, right? Like, we get more worried about, again, not at all about the sex, right? Just about the money side of it. Sex with animals, not the same. Don't do that. You'll be put to death. I don't think we need to say more about that. Don't do that. That's bad. In the midst of that, the sorceress thing. And this actually comes into play later in the story of the kings, but we won't. What's the idea here? The idea is people who engage in the arcane or the mysterious outside of God, right? We know that there are things, we would say supernatural, right? Above the natural. God is supernatural, right? Like he is above and beyond the natural world. And supernatural encounters with God are good. And like that becomes like if there is such a thing, the ordinary or the normal means of engaging in something that is above natural is through God. Um, there are other beings than God who are above what we experience in nature. And anybody that we're going to be engaging with in that way that is outside of going through God isn't going to be one of his angels, right? Um, you're messing with things that are almost inherently demonic when you try to do that. It's not to say that there aren't means of engaging with the supernatural outside of God. It's to say that you're not dealing with something good when you do that. And so, is there the possibility of some kind of sorcery or witchcraft that's not just like empowering women in a culture that was very against women and sharing like herbs and healing and things like that, right? There are versions of witchcraft that are harmless, right? And we burned a lot of witches who were just relatively smart women seeking to educate themselves, and that was an awful thing to do. There are, however, people that seek to engage with not just natural things outside of channels of God and get involved knowingly or unknowingly with the demonic. And that can greatly corrupt a person's soul and to lead to corrupting the things that are around them as well. Today, we wouldn't kill a person like that, right? We have exorcisms, we have means of dealing with trying to help those people. Back then, what did they have to deal with something like that? There's no way to rehabilitate something like that, and you have to stop it from spreading. So this is not a thing where we should be justifying killing witches now, or even like you can't read Harry Potter because sorcery is bad, right? Like we should be reasonable about it, but the idea of trying to access things above the natural, above and beyond the natural, outside of the channels established with God, don't do that. There are a number of different things here. I'll focus on two. One of them is stuff that you are doing for God, right? Don't sacrifice to other gods is just more of that first commandment, right? Like, in case you missed, you shall have no other gods before me. Like, more particularly, that means you don't sacrifice to other gods, right? Like, not just before, like, you just don't sacrifice to other gods. Just don't do that. Really, don't. And then there's this other idea at the end of the text, the firstborn of your sons you shall give to me. You shall do likewise with your oxen and with your sheep. What's that? That we're not very far past the foundation for that, right? There were plagues. There were 9 of them that didn't do anything, and then there was a big deal one, the 10th one, where the firstborn were killed of man and beast, except where the doorpost had been painted in blood. Blood was the price for life. But all that caused, putting that blood on the doorpost didn't cause God to say, oh, never mind, you don't owe me that. The angel just skipped those houses and didn't go in to collect because some form of debt had been paid. A debt was still owed, and that was the firstborn. It's just that God said you could trade something, the animal, the sacrifice for the Passover, for the debt that was owed. Um, that plague never stopped, right? All the other ones stop. And in fact, we talked through them about, in many cases, the more powerful thing that happens isn't the starting of the plague, but the stopping of it. That 10th one, that didn't stop. The firstborn, all firstborn are still owed to God. It is still possible to trade a life in exchange, but the firstborn had to be redeemed through all of Israelite and Jewish history. No one had the power to stop that plague. We don't do that now, though. That isn't the thing anymore, which is why it seems unusual to us. What do you suppose happened? It was stopped, but it wasn't stopped by Moses. It was stopped by Jesus. That the debt was no longer just skipped by God's own firstborn, was paid as a price and was so super abundant in terms of the offering that it fully paid the debt owed by all generations. Nothing else is owed. The ledger is evened. But only Jesus had the power to stop that last plague. So plagues are basically persisting on humanity, very interestingly, from the first plague until Jesus, who finally stops them. So the second point then is one of how we treat people who are disadvantaged or have afflicted, right? Like widows and orphans, right? People who life circumstances or strangers in your land, right? There are people who are in a position of extreme vulnerability due to just life. It's not okay to take advantage of that. And it is good to help that. Don't take advantage of people who are in a vulnerable situation. It's less clear. We don't really get to an or else on that one. It's just don't do that. And God will hear their cry if you are doing that, and I will get you. Not because nobody else is there to speak for these people, so God, will take that upon myself and I will do it. So don't mistreat the vulnerable. So a couple points here to talk about as well. The first one is not bearing false witness, or lying or distorting truth for any reason, up to and including bribes, for the sake of changing how a case goes, even should it be in favor of the poor. Tell the truth in these situations and bear accurate witness. This isn't always tell the truth, but it can certainly be extrapolated to that, right? Most of us in our lives can go a very long time without, possibly the whole time, without ever actually being a witness in a legal sense. Does that mean this doesn't apply to us at all? No, right? How often in our various social relationships and circles do we talk about things that have happened? And do we maybe have an opportunity to present a colored version of something or to straight out lie, right? This isn't just in court that we bear witness that has consequences for people. It is all the time. Uh, well, it's good in general not to be gossiping about people when like the situation merits. We should be very careful to be truthful up to and including if you're not sure, you should probably keep your mouth shut. And in fact, in a lot of those situations, more often than not, if we learn to keep our mouths shut more, less harm would be done. But that aside, don't give false report about people. So that's that one. Then there's another one that comes up later and that gets glossed over, but that matters, which is verses 10 and 11 here. For 6 years you shall sow your land and gather its yield, but the 7th year you shall let it rest and lie fallow, that the poor of your people may eat, and what they leave the wild beasts may eat. You shall do likewise with your vineyard and with your olive orchard. People aren't farming right now. So this is one of those things that, some of this was written down farther into the future, let's say, after the people were in the land and were more likely to be farming. That said, this is not about crop rotation, right? Now we know it could be also that, and it could have been God working toward that. Now we know that that can be a thing, that rotating your crops or resting your field can be a helpful thing, preferably rotating, because who would want to let it go, your land go unplanted? You're losing money. The period of time here matters, right? This is an extension of the idea of Sabbath, right? God has given you this land and it is set apart for him. And he's said, I gave this to you so you can take what it produces 6 out of 7 years, and you have to give to the poor and to beasts, not for yourself, the produce of the land on the 7th year. This is here. It's written down. It's a thing that the people are very explicitly told to do. To my knowledge, we never in the Bible see them manage to do this. They forget this one because that's a big ask, right? Like that is a big ask. If you're struggling to get by, and you are a farmer and you have to leave your fields barren or not plant your fields for a year, like that's unsustainable, right? Like this is not an easy ask. It is a thing that was asked, and it comes around a little bit later. People have connected. I haven't done a lot of detailed research into this myself to know like if I support the theory, but people have interestingly connected the amount of time that these people spend in exile in Babylon to the number of years that they neglected to leave barren or fallow, to not plant their fields, to these Sabbath years that the people neglected. It's an interesting concept, if nothing else. And because we're not right now with the people in the Holy Land, there's not a lot of digging into what they do or don't do when they get there that we need to do here. But in general, this gets pretty thoroughly ignored. And that makes it interesting by itself. Is God asking us today to quit working 1 out of every 7 years? No. So what does this mean for us today? There is, and maybe, I don't know for sure, maybe it's as simple as the tithe, right? There's a different idea because it's the land that produces, and you still it doesn't not produce during this year, right? There's the talk of, the poor can come in and pick from things that are growing and the beast can eat it. Like, there's still produce happening on the land. You're just not cultivating it or harvesting it in any way. So there's an idea of what God causes to be produced or to generate belongs to God and not to you. And so you get to take from what comes from God, but there need to be limits to that that follow the kind of the same pattern of all of creation and the same limits of all of creation, that seventh thing belongs to God. I think that's more than the idea of a tithe, right? Because that's what I earn goes to help support God and the church, rather than what God produces, I should not assume is mine, right? Like, if God allows me to share in what he produces, that doesn't mean that it is mine. And I need to have boundaries in place that allow me to be mindful that it comes from and belongs to God. For this one, I want to talk about the other religious items that come up here as area of focus. Big one, Sabbath. Of all religious practices in the Bible, which one comes first? Sabbath. That never goes away, right? Like, animal sacrifice, Jesus changes a lot, and like, we don't do it. As some of these practices develop, the more they evolve and develop, the less likely we are to still do them in their current form, right? The earlier and more foundational they are, the more important they are to still be doing them. This is the first one. It's also the one that's mentioned and talked about the most, and they still do it in the New Testament. It's in the first book of the Bible. It's in the last book of the Bible. It's in nearly all the ones in between. It matters to keep the Sabbath. It mattered from the beginning of creation, and it matters now. And it matters every time in between. We've talked about it already on these Exodus videos. I won't get into it a whole lot more than that, other than just to say it comes up so much because it matters so much, and we don't do it today. Most of us don't do it very well, if at all, right? You're kind of lucky most of the time, myself included, to make it to Mass on Sundays, right? That's not keeping the Sabbath. That's the bare minimum. And that's meant to be a thing that informs and shapes, like, it's the whole day, right? It's not an hour of the day. It's not, I can't do 24 times 7 minus 1 in my head right now, right? It's not all of the hours minus 1 you shall keep for work, and then 1 hour you shall set apart, and that's for me, God, and you shall rest on that 1 hour, right? Like, it's 6 days in one day, not whatever that math is, 6 days plus 23 hours and 1 hour. It's not that. So if all you are doing on your Sabbath day is going to church, you are not doing a Sabbath day. I won't belabor the point. I've talked about it a lot, but first and most important religious practice in the Bible, foundation from which all other religious practice comes, it takes a whole day every week. Are you doing that? Am I doing that? Then there's one other one that comes up but can't possibly. This is where you get evidence that perhaps this happened some of this was written down a little later. Um, there are the three mandatory feasts that ultimately are meant to be celebrated in Jerusalem. Um, and that's where shall you appear 3 times in the year, shall all your males appear before the Lord God. We're already foreshadowing some of what this rule becomes. You could argue very reasonably that when this is being written down, that was already a thing. And the holy city was already established. And that would make a lot of sense. You don't have to accept that. If you want to believe that Moses wrote all of this down himself, the church does not prohibit you having that interpretation as well. But there are some things that lend credence to the idea that at least some parts of this were written notably later than when this happened, which doesn't make it not true, as we've talked about. These 3 feasts matter, right? So what really matters? The Sabbath. What then matters beyond that, especially these 3 feasts? We have some major feasts. These aren't the same as, but in how we treat them, obviously Christmas and Easter, and probably Pentecost, because Pentecost and Easter are actually 2 of these 3 feasts. Christmas isn't. But we can have some important holy days that, like Christmas and Easter, are the ones we fix whole seasons around, right? And we have these big holy days, and even people who don't go to church the rest of the time probably go to church some of these times, and we make a big deal out of it. And we should. This is secondary and way behind in importance that Sabbath one, right? We really easily can fall into flipping the importance, right? I can muster up doing, that's not just only giving God 1 hour out of 6 days plus 23 hours, right? That's giving God 2 hours, long masses, maybe you go to the whole Triduum. That's giving God 5 hours out of 364 days plus 19 hours, right? Like, okay, so I can muster it up and really do these 2 days right, and I'll be good, right? Like, if we're not doing enough with an hour a week, that's certainly not going to get it done, right? If you're looking at where to focus your effort, don't put more effort into Lent and Easter and then whatever. Like, put the effort into that day every week where the effort's supposed to go. And then those other seasons will naturally flow from that, and you'll be amazed. Those will just sort of work out, and you don't have to do anything more at all for those if you're keeping the Sabbath. Easter's on a Sunday. You've got a few days leading up to it, and you should do something during Lent, but that's kind of built in. Christmas is not a Sunday usually, but you're going to do that anyway. Like, really, it will flow very naturally, and you will be fine as long as you're doing the Sabbath one, right? The whole idea of that is that sanctifies kind of time itself as you experience it, and carves out and does so much to your life. Really, I said I wasn't going to belabor the point, and now I am, right? It cannot be overstated how important this idea of Sabbath is to living a holy life, and how badly we neglect it. So anyway, food for thought. Lots of rules here, big T, small t traditions, different things. Some of these things change and evolve over time, up to and including the day on which we celebrate the Sabbath is Sunday now and not Saturday. But the overall overarching principle that some of these core ideas true no matter what. Hopefully that was enough to see in some of these very old things some idea of how we can better live today. This has been an overview of Lesson 18 of the Turning to God's Word Bible Study, You Shall Have No Other Gods, the Book of Exodus. For more information, consult our written study and visit us online at turningtogodsword.com.